After carefully studying strange luminescent specimens glowing in his greenhouse and showing them to agricultural experts, what they reveal about the future of farming leaves him speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Farmer Marcus Chen had always prided himself on running a state-of-the-art hydroponic farm in the outskirts of Washington state. His indoor farming facility, nestled in the shadow of Mount Rainier, had been at the forefront of sustainable agriculture for over a decade. But lately, the soaring energy costs of maintaining optimal growing conditions had pushed his operation to the brink of bankruptcy. His life's work of growing fresh produce year-round for local communities was slipping through his fingers, one unpaid utility bill at a time. The massive greenhouse complex that had once been his pride and joy now felt like a weight around his neck. Row after row of carefully maintained hydroponic systems stretched into the distance, their LED growing lights casting an artificial purple glow across the facility. These lights, once a symbol of agricultural innovation, had become his biggest burden. The monthly electricity bill alone had tripled in the past year, eating away at whatever profit margins he had managed to maintain. That fateful night, Marcus was doing what he'd done every evening for the past 20 years, making his final rounds before shutting down for the day. The gentle hum of water circulating through the hydroponic systems accompanied his footsteps as he checked each section's nutrient levels and temperature readings. He'd already had to shut down 3 growing sections this month to cut costs, and the sight of those dark, empty rows felt like personal failures. As he approached Section E, where several LED panels had malfunctioned days ago, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him, a reflection perhaps, or maybe the moonlight streaming through the greenhouse panels. But as he drew closer, his heart began to race. There, in the darkest corner of the section, where the broken lights had left the plants in complete darkness for the past week, something impossible was happening. A cluster of tomato plants was glowing, not the harsh, artificial purple of LED grow lights, but a soft, ethereal blue-green luminescence that seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat. The light emanated from every part of the plant. Their stems, leaves, and even the small, unripe tomatoes themselves gave off the mysterious glow. Marcus stood frozen in place, his clipboard clattering to the floor as he tried to process what he was seeing. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself, his voice echoing in the empty greenhouse. He pulled out his phone and started recording, his hands shaking so badly he had to restart twice. The plants continued their gentle pulsing, undisturbed by his presence or the phone's light. Marcus reached out tentatively to touch one of the glowing leaves, half expecting it to dissolve under his fingers like a mirage. But it felt real, solid, and alive, yet somehow radiating its own light like some sort of biological lamp. His mind raced through possible explanations. Could this be some sort of contamination? A new plant disease? Or perhaps a mutation caused by the stress of darkness? In his 2 decades of hydroponic farming, he'd seen plants adapt to various conditions, but nothing like this. These were supposed to be ordinary tomato plants, the same variety he'd been growing for years, the same seeds, the same nutrient solution, the same everything, except for that broken LED panel. As Marcus examined the plants more closely, he noticed something even more extraordinary. Despite being deprived of artificial light for days, these plants appeared healthier than their illuminated counterparts. Their leaves were a deep, vibrant green beneath the blue glow, and the developing tomatoes looked perfectly formed. It defied everything he knew about plant growth and photosynthesis. The implications began to dawn on him slowly, like the first rays of sunrise creeping over the horizon. If these plants could truly generate their own light, if they could thrive without the energy-hungry LED systems that were bankrupting his farm. Marcus's hands trembled as he collected leaf samples and carefully documented everything with his phone's camera. He knew he needed expert eyes on this discovery, but he also knew how incredible, how impossible, his claims would sound. As he finally left the greenhouse that night, long past his usual closing time, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something that could either make him a pioneer in agricultural innovation or mark him as the laughingstock of the farming community. Either way, he knew his life would never be the same after this night. The glowing plants in Section E had just opened a door to possibilities he never could have imagined, and there was no turning back now. Marcus's journey into hydroponic farming hadn't started with dreams of scientific breakthroughs or agricultural innovations. 25 years ago, he had been a software engineer in Seattle's booming tech industry, writing code for companies that promised to change the world through apps and algorithms. The work paid well, but something had always felt missing. It wasn't until he started volunteering at a local community garden that he found his true calling. The garden had been a small operation, tucked between apartment buildings in one of Seattle's food deserts, neighborhoods where fresh produce was scarce and processed foods dominated corner store shelves. Every weekend, Marcus would watch elderly residents carefully selecting vegetables they could actually afford, children tasting fresh tomatoes for the first time, and families coming together over shared plots of earth. That's when he realized that real change didn't always come through lines of code. Sometimes it grew from the ground up. Using his tech industry savings, Marcus had purchased the abandoned warehouse complex that would become Green Future Farms. The location had seemed perfect, close enough to Seattle to serve urban communities, but far enough out to afford the space needed for a large-scale operation. He'd spent 2 years converting the warehouse into a state-of-the-art hydroponic facility, installing sophisticated climate control systems and LED growing lights that promised optimal growth year-round. The early years had been a stunning success. Green Future Farms had quickly become known for its consistently high-quality produce and innovative growing techniques. Marcus had pioneered new methods of vertical farming that maximized space efficiency, and his computer background helped him develop automated systems that precisely controlled every aspect of the growing environment. Local restaurants competed for his specialty herbs and vegetables, and several grocery chains had signed exclusive contracts for his premium produce. But success had come with its own price tag. The energy-intensive nature of indoor farming meant that his operation consumed as much electricity as a small town. When energy prices were stable, the math had worked out. The premium prices his produce commanded had more than covered the operational costs. But the recent energy crisis had changed everything. His monthly utility bills had skyrocketed from $45,000 to nearly $150,000, while market pressures kept him from raising his prices enough to compensate. Marcus had tried everything to keep the farm afloat. He'd installed solar panels on every available surface, but the cloudy Washington weather meant they only offset a fraction of his power needs. He'd experimented with reduced lighting schedules, but the resulting drop in yield had only made things worse. He'd even taken out a second mortgage on his house, pouring his personal savings into the farm to keep it running. The stress had taken its toll on his personal life as well. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, his wife unable to handle the constant anxiety of their mounting debt. His teenage daughter, Amy, still visited on weekends, but he could see the worry in her eyes when she looked at him. The same worry he saw in the mirror every morning. The dark circles under his eyes and the deepening lines on his face told the story of countless sleepless nights spent poring over spreadsheets, searching for a solution that seemed increasingly out of reach. Just last week, his bank had denied his application for another operating loan. The loan officer, a woman who had approved his original business plan with enthusiasm, had looked at him with pity as she explained that the numbers simply didn't work anymore. Without a significant change, Green Future Farms would be unable to meet its obligations within 3 months. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His attempt to create a sustainable farming operation was being undermined by its dependence on unsustainable energy consumption. He had set out to help solve food security issues in urban communities, but instead found himself trapped in a technological paradox of his own making. The complex systems he had once been so proud of now seemed like elaborate monuments to an approach that was fundamentally flawed. And yet, despite all this, Marcus couldn't bring himself to give up. Every time he considered closing down, he thought about the families who relied on his produce, the employees who depended on their paychecks, and the promise he had made to himself in that community garden all those years ago. He had to find a way forward, had to discover some solution that would allow him to continue his mission of providing fresh, sustainable produce to his community. Now, as he sat in his office the morning after discovering the glowing plants, staring at the video he'd taken on his phone, Marcus wondered if he had finally lost his grip on reality. The soft, blue-green glow pulsing from the screen seemed to mock everything he knew about plant biology. But if what he was seeing was real, if plants could somehow be modified to produce their own light, it could change everything. Not just for his farm, but for indoor agriculture everywhere. The morning sun was streaming through his office windows as Marcus replayed the video for the 20th time. Each viewing only raised more questions. Should he contact university researchers, alert the agricultural board, or keep this discovery quiet until he understood more about what was happening? The wrong choice could have devastating consequences for his farm, his reputation, and possibly even his freedom if these plants proved to be dangerous. Marcus pulled up his browser and began researching bioluminescent plants. There had been experiments with tobacco plants engineered to glow, but nothing like what he was seeing in Section E. Those engineered plants had produced a weak, constant glow that required special cameras to detect. His plants pulsed with visible light, bright enough to read by. More importantly, his plants hadn't been engineered at all. They had spontaneously developed this ability after being left in darkness. The scientific implications were staggering. If plants could naturally adapt to produce their own light, it could revolutionize indoor farming. No more massive electricity bills for artificial lighting. No more complex LED systems to maintain. The energy savings alone could make indoor farming economically viable in regions where it had never been possible before. But doubt gnawed at him. What if the plants were contaminated with something dangerous? The rational part of his brain kept returning to this possibility. Bioluminescent bacteria existed in nature. What if some new strain had infected his crops? He could be sitting on a potential agricultural disaster. If he went public with this discovery and it turned out to be harmful, he'd be ruined. His farm would be shut down, his remaining assets seized to pay for cleanup costs, and his name would become synonymous with agricultural negligence. The sound of cars pulling into the parking lot snapped Marcus from his thoughts. His employees would be arriving soon for their morning shift. He quickly closed the video and shoved his phone in his pocket. Through his office window, he could see Maria, his head grower, walking toward the main entrance. She had been with him since the beginning, and if anyone could help him make sense of this situation, it would be her. But telling her meant risking the information spreading before he was ready. Marcus picked up his tablet and pulled up the environmental data from Section E: temperature, humidity, CO2 levels. Everything looked normal except for the light readings, which showed zero photosynthetically active radiation since the LED panel failure. According to everything he knew about plant science, those tomato plants should be showing signs of stress, not thriving. The fact that they were healthier than ever defied explanation. His phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "Dad, don't forget about dinner tonight. Mom's worried about you." The message hit him like a physical blow. His ex-wife's concern, transmitted through their daughter, reminded him just how much his obsession with saving the farm had already cost him. If he pursued this discovery and it went wrong, he could lose what little stability he had left in his life. But as he stood up to begin his morning routine, another thought struck him. What if he did nothing? What if he simply replaced the broken LED panel and pretended he'd never seen the glowing plants? The rational choice would be to protect himself, to avoid the risk of further financial and personal damage. Yet even as he considered this option, he knew he couldn't take it. The potential benefits of understanding these plants were too important to ignore. Marcus thought about the community garden where his journey had started, about the families who relied on affordable fresh produce, about the global challenges of feeding a growing population in a warming world. If these plants could help solve any of those problems, did he have the right to keep them hidden? Walking to his desk, Marcus picked up his phone again and opened his contacts. His finger hovered over the name Dr. Sarah Thompson, a plant geneticist he'd met at an agricultural conference last year. She had been interested in his hydroponic systems and had given him her card. telling him to reach out if he ever needed expert consultation. If anyone could help him understand what was happening with these plants while maintaining discretion, it would be her. But before T could tap the call button, doubt crept in again. Dr. Thompson worked for a major agricultural university. Once he showed her the plants, he would lose control of the discovery. The university might claim rights to any developments, or worse, determine that the plants posed a threat and order them destroyed. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. Marcus looked at his phone again, then at the door where he could hear his employees beginning their day, then back at his phone. Whatever he decided in the next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that couldn't be undone. The future of his farm, his legacy, and possibly the future of agriculture itself hung in the balance. With a deep breath, he made his choice. Marcus's fingers moved decisively across his phone screen, but not to call Dr. Thompson. Instead, he opened his calendar and blocked out the next 7 days. If he was going to risk everything on these plants, he needed to understand them first. He would document everything meticulously, gather concrete data, and only then decide who to trust with this discovery. First, he needed to ensure no one else would stumble upon the glowing plants. Marcus walked briskly to Section E, his mind already formulating a plan. The morning shift workers were focused on their tasks in other areas, giving him the privacy he needed. He quickly put up quarantine zone, equipment malfunction signs around the section, and sealed off the area with yellow caution tape. It wasn't unusual for him to isolate sections for testing new growing methods, so this wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. Back in his office, Marcus created a secure digital folder on his private server, encrypted with a password only he knew. He transferred the video from his phone and began organizing his documentation. Years of working in software had taught him the importance of systematic testing and detailed record-keeping. He would approach this discovery with the same methodical precision he had once applied to debugging code. That evening, after his employees had left, Marcus began his real work. He set up a series of high-definition cameras around the glowing plants, programmed to take photos every 15 minutes. He installed specialized sensors to measure light intensity, wavelength, and any changes in temperature or radiation. The equipment would cost him thousands of dollars he couldn't really afford, but he had to know exactly what he was dealing with. As he worked, Marcus noticed something he had missed in his initial shock the night before. The plant's glow seemed to follow a pattern. Every few minutes, the blue-green light would pulse slightly brighter, then fade back to its baseline luminescence. He checked the environmental sensors. There was no corresponding fluctuation in temperature or humidity. The plants were operating on some internal rhythm he couldn't yet understand. Over the next few days, Marcus fell into an exhausting routine. He would arrive hours before his staff, download the overnight data, take samples, and run basic tests with the limited equipment he had. During regular hours, he maintained his normal schedule, though his employees noticed he seemed more distracted than usual. After everyone left, he would return to Section E, sometimes staying until dawn, measuring and documenting everything he could about the mysterious plants. The data he gathered was fascinating. The glowing plants were consuming about 30% less nutrient solution than their normal counterparts, yet their growth rate had increased by almost 50%. The tomatoes they produced were larger and developed faster than any he had grown before. Most remarkably, the plants seemed to be influencing their non-luminescent neighbors. The regular tomato plants closest to the glowing ones were showing subtle signs of change. Their leaves were developing a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the dark. On the fourth night of his observation, Marcus noticed something that made his heart race. He was taking leaf samples when he spotted tiny spots of luminescence on a previously normal plant. The glow was weak, barely visible even in complete darkness, but it was definitely there. The ability to produce light wasn't just a mutation, it was spreading. This discovery both thrilled and terrified him. If the plants could transfer this characteristic to others, it meant the trait was somehow communicable. His scientific mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a viral vector? Chemical signaling? Some form of bacterial symbiosis? The implications were staggering, but so were the potential risks. He needed more sophisticated testing equipment than what he had available, but ordering it might raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. As the week progressed, Marcus's obsession with the plants grew stronger. He began keeping detailed journals of every observation, no matter how small. He sketched diagrams of the light patterns, recorded time-lapse videos, and filled notebooks with theories and questions. His daughter Amy called twice more, worried about his canceled dinner plans, but he could barely focus on their conversations. Every moment away from Section E felt like a missed opportunity to understand what was happening. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. Dark circles deepened under his eyes, and he caught himself making simple mistakes in his regular farm management duties. Maria, his head grower, started giving him concerned looks, but he brushed off her questions about his well-being. He couldn't risk sharing his secret yet, not until he had more concrete evidence about what was happening in Section E. By the end of the week, Marcus had accumulated enough data to fill a small textbook, but he still felt no closer to understanding the fundamental nature of his discovery. The plants continued to thrive and spread their luminescent properties, defying everything he thought he knew about plant biology. He knew he couldn't keep this contained forever. Soon, he would have to make another choice about who to trust with his discovery. The first real crisis came on day 8. Marcus arrived at the greenhouse before dawn, as had become his routine, only to find that the security keypad by Section E's entrance was malfunctioning. The digital display flickered erratically, showing random characters before going dark completely. His hands shook as he used his manual override key, wondering if this was somehow connected to the spreading luminescence. Inside Section E, everything appeared normal at first glance. The glowing plants cast their ethereal blue-green light across the space, creating dancing shadows on the walls. But as Marcus approached his monitoring station, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The specialized sensors he'd set up to measure light intensity were displaying impossible readings, numbers that fluctuated wildly between 0 and values so high they couldn't be real. Then, he saw it. A fine, powder-like substance had settled on his equipment, giving off the same subtle luminescence as the plants. He reached out to touch it but stopped himself just in time. Instead, he pulled on a pair of protective gloves and carefully collected a sample in a sterile container. Under his portable microscope, the powder looked like plant spores, but unlike anything he'd seen before. They pulsed with their own inner light, like tiny stars scattered across the slide. "What have I done?" Marcus whispered to himself, the weight of his situation suddenly crushing down on him. He had kept this discovery secret, convinced he could handle it alone. But now the plants weren't just growing and glowing. They were reproducing in ways he couldn't control. The implications terrified him. If these spores got into the ventilation system, Marcus rushed to check the air handling units. The industrial-grade filters should have caught anything this size. But he had to be sure. As he examined the filter panels, his worst fears were confirmed. The edges of the filters glowed faintly in the dim light. The spores had already begun to spread beyond Section E. With trembling fingers, Marcus pulled out his phone to document this new development. But as he raised it to take a picture, the screen went black. He tried rebooting it, but nothing happened. The device was dead, despite having been fully charged just hours ago. A horrible suspicion formed in his mind. He hurried back to his monitoring station and found that every piece of electronic equipment in the immediate vicinity of the glowing plants had failed. The plants weren't just affecting their own kind anymore. They were somehow interfering with electronics. Whether through some form of electromagnetic field or another mechanism he didn't understand, the luminescent organisms were proving far more disruptive than he'd imagined. Marcus thought about the implications. If this spread, it could affect not just his farm systems, but potentially any electronics in range. He needed to contain this and fast, but as he began gathering materials for a makeshift containment system, another problem emerged. The regular tomato plants that had started showing signs of luminescence were now glowing almost as brightly as the originals. The trait wasn't just spreading, it was accelerating. Marcus worked frantically through the morning, using plastic sheeting and duct tape to create a temporary containment zone. He sealed off vents, covered equipment, and set up a makeshift decontamination area at the entrance. But even as he worked, he could see more spores drifting through the air, carrying their mysterious glow to new areas of the greenhouse. His phone's death meant he'd lost his primary means of documentation, so he resorted to taking notes by hand. As he wrote, he noticed his pen leaving a faintly luminescent trail on the paper. The ink itself was beginning to glow. The phenomenon was affecting chemical compounds now, not just living tissue. The scope of what he was dealing with expanded with each passing hour. By mid-morning, Marcus had to face a harsh reality. This was no longer just about saving his farm or making a scientific breakthrough. He had inadvertently become the custodian of something that could either revolutionize agriculture or potentially threaten it. The glowing plants were evolving faster than he could study them, developing capabilities he couldn't predict or control. His head pounded as he tried to think through his options. Destroying the plants might be the safest course of action, but something held him back. Despite the risks, their potential benefits couldn't be ignored. The plants were still growing faster and stronger than any conventional crops, using less energy and fewer nutrients. If he could just understand and control their spread. A knock at the door nearly made him jump out of his skin. "Marcus?" It was Maria's voice. "The automatic watering system in Section D is acting up. The controls aren't responding and—" She paused, her voice taking on a strange tone. "There's something weird about the water in the hydroponic lines. It's glowing?" Marcus closed his eyes, fighting back a wave of panic. The contamination had reached the main water system. If the luminescent properties had indeed become water-soluble, the entire hydroponic network could be affected within hours. He had to make a decision now, before things spiraled completely out of control. "I'll be right there," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. As he gathered his thoughts, a new realization struck him. The plants weren't just spreading their properties anymore. They were adapting to their environment in real time, finding new ways to propagate their characteristics. They had moved from air to water, from living tissue to electronic systems. What would they affect next? Marcus looked at his watch, one of the few pieces of non-electronic equipment he had left, and made a mental calculation. He had maybe hours at most before this situation became impossible to contain. The time for working in secret was over. He needed help, and he needed it now. The question was, who could he trust with something this potentially dangerous, yet revolutionary? Marcus rushed to Section D, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. The hydroponic channels were emanating a subtle blue-green glow, the same color as his original plants. But this wasn't just contaminated water. The liquid seemed to be changing properties before his eyes. It had become slightly viscous, almost gel-like, and the glow was intensifying with each passing minute. "Maria, shut down the main pump system," he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Now!" But it was too late. Warning lights began flashing across the control panel, or at least, the ones that still worked. The main circulation system had already distributed the luminescent water throughout most of the facility. Through the greenhouse's glass panels, Marcus could see the web of hydroponic tubes beginning to glow, creating a network of light that would soon be visible from the highway. "Marcus, what's happening?" Maria's voice trembled slightly. "What is this stuff?" Before he could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the greenhouse. One of the hydroponic tubes had split, releasing a stream of glowing liquid onto the concrete floor. The liquid didn't behave like water should. Instead of spreading out in a puddle, it began moving with purpose, like a living thing, seeking out the smallest cracks in the concrete. "Everyone out!" Marcus shouted to the handful of workers who had gathered to watch. "Now, go home. Take the rest of the day off." He turned to Maria, who stood rooted in place. "Maria, please. I'll explain everything later, but right now you need to leave. The workers hesitated only briefly before hurrying toward the exits. As they left, Marcus could hear their worried whispers, knew they were already pulling out their phones to record what they'd seen. By nightfall, social media would be buzzing with speculation about the strange lights at Green Future Farms. Once everyone had gone, Marcus returned to Section E, his original quarantine zone. The scene that greeted him was like something from a science fiction movie. The glowing plants had grown dramatically in just the few hours he'd been away, their vines now reaching toward the ceiling. The spores in the air had increased tenfold, creating an ethereal, floating galaxy of light points that swirled with the slightest movement. His monitoring equipment was completely dead now, and even his backup battery-powered devices refused to function. The plants seemed to be generating some kind of electromagnetic field that disrupted anything electronic within their growing radius. Marcus pulled out his old analog thermometer. It read 15 degrees higher than normal, despite the climate control system still running at full power. The plants were generating heat now, too. Marcus slumped against the wall, exhaustion and despair washing over him. He had thought he could control this, study it, harness it for the greater good. Instead, he had potentially unleashed something that could destroy everything he'd worked for. His farm, his reputation, his future, all of it was slipping away as surely as the glowing liquid seeping through his greenhouse floor. His phone buzzed in his pocket, one of the few devices still working, probably because he'd kept it away from Section E. It was Amy again. "Dad, there are weird videos of your farm showing up online. Mom's really worried. What's going on?" Before he could reply, the phone died in his hand. The plant's influence was spreading faster than ever. Through the greenhouse windows, he could see the sun beginning to set, which meant soon the glow from his facility would be visible for miles around. He had hours, at most, before authorities started asking questions. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of his mistakes crushing down on him. He should have called Dr. Thompson immediately. Should have alerted the proper authorities. Should have contained this when it was still containable. Now, his discovery had evolved beyond his understanding or control. The sound of sirens in the distance made his heart skip a beat. Someone must have called emergency services, probably concerned about the strange lights and dead electronics. Marcus knew how it would look. A failing farmer, desperate to save his business, experimenting with something he didn't understand. He glanced at the main water tank that fed the hydroponic systems. The entire reservoir was glowing now, the luminescent liquid seeming to swirl with a life of its own. The tank's electronic sensors were offline, but Marcus could swear the water level was rising, even though no pumps were running. The plants weren't just adapting to their environment anymore. They were changing fundamental physical properties of matter. A sharp pain in his hand made him look down. The pen he'd been using to take notes had begun to corrode, eating through the plastic casing. The luminescent properties weren't just spreading, they were becoming more aggressive, more invasive. What had started as a beautiful mystery was turning into something potentially catastrophic. Marcus heard more sirens, closer now. Through the greenhouse glass, he could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles approaching. In a matter of minutes, his secret would be exposed to the world. But would anyone believe his explanation? Would they understand that he had never meant for any of this to happen? As he watched the glowing tendrils of his plants reach ever higher, Marcus realized he had reached his breaking point. He couldn't handle this alone anymore. Whatever consequences came next, he had to tell the truth. But as he turned to walk toward the approaching authorities, a new sound caught his attention, a high-pitched humming emanating from Section E, growing louder by the second. The humming from Section E reached a fever pitch just as the first emergency vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Marcus was about to step outside when a familiar voice called out behind him. I wondered how long it would take for this to get out of hand. Marcus spun around to find Dr. Sarah Thompson standing in the doorway to Section E, her silver hair gleaming in the ethereal light of the plants. She wore a hazmat suit and carried a heavy equipment case marked with biohazard symbols. Behind her, two more figures in protective gear were unloading equipment from an unmarked van. How did you... Marcus began. Maria called me 3 days ago. Dr. Thompson interrupted, her voice muffled by her protective mask. She's been worried about you, and when she noticed the first signs of bioluminescence in the regular crops, she knew something was wrong. I've been monitoring the situation from afar, waiting to see if you'd reach out yourself. Relief and anger warred in Marcus's chest. You've known for days? Why didn't you come sooner? Because I needed to see how the phenomenon would develop naturally without interference, she replied, setting up what looked like specialized monitoring equipment. And because I needed to be sure about what we're dealing with. Marcus, what's happening in your greenhouse isn't just a mutation or a viral infection. It's something entirely new to science. The approaching sirens grew louder. Dr. Thompson gestured to one of her associates, who hurried outside to intercept the emergency responders. Don't worry, she said, noting Marcus's concerned expression. We have protocols for situations like this. Well, not exactly like this, but similar enough. The local authorities will secure the perimeter while we assess the situation. Marcus watched in amazement as Dr. Thompson's team transformed his greenhouse into a sophisticated research station. They set up electromagnetic field sensors, spectral analyzers, and equipment he didn't even recognize. All of it was analog or specially shielded against the plant's disruptive effects. Your notes were quite thorough, Doctor, Thompson commented as she calibrated a device. The progression you documented, from simple bioluminescence to electromagnetic interference to water property alteration, it's unprecedented. But it's not random. There's a pattern here. A purpose. A purpose? Marcus asked, following her as she moved methodically through the greenhouse. These are plants, not conscious beings. Are they? Dr. Thompson paused, turning to face him. Look at the pattern of spread, the way they've adapted to overcome each obstacle. They're not just growing or mutating, they're evolving in real time, responding to their environment with an intelligence we've never seen in plant life. Outside, Marcus could hear official-sounding voices and see more vehicles arriving. Dr. Thompson's associate returned, nodding to her. The perimeter is secure. We've implemented containment protocol Beta 7. The official story is a chemical spill requiring specialized cleanup. Good, Dr. Thompson replied. That should buy us some time. She turned back to Marcus. Now, I need you to tell me exactly when and how this started. Every detail matters. As Marcus recounted the discovery of the first glowing plants, Dr. Thompson's team worked around them, taking samples and readings. The humming from Section E had subsided, but the plant's glow seemed to pulse in response to their presence, as if aware they were being studied. The timing is remarkable, Doctor, Thompson mused when he finished. Just when your farm was on the brink of failure due to energy costs, you discover plants that can generate their own light. But more than that, plants that might represent a fundamental shift in our understanding of biological adaptation. What do you mean? Marcus asked, watching as one of the scientists carefully collected spores in a sealed container. These plants aren't just coping with darkness, they're mastering it. They've developed a way to generate and transmit energy that goes beyond anything we've seen in nature. The bioluminescence, the electromagnetic fields, the altered water properties. It's all connected. They're creating their own ecosystem, their own rules of physics. A loud crack from overhead made everyone look up. The growing vines had reached the ceiling, and the glass panels were beginning to splinter under their pressure. Dr. Thompson quickly directed her team to set up reinforcement barriers. We need to contain this, she said urgently, but we also need to understand it. Marcus, I'll be honest with you. What's happening here could be either the greatest agricultural breakthrough in history or the beginning of an ecological disaster. The next few hours will be crucial. She placed a hand on his shoulder. I know you've been carrying this burden alone, trying to protect your farm and your discovery. But you're not alone anymore. My team specializes in unusual biological phenomena. We can help, but you have to trust us completely. No more secrets. Marcus looked around his greenhouse at the swirling spores and pulsing plants, at the professional team working with practiced efficiency to understand and contain his discovery. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. But, as he watched Dr. Thompson's team at work, a new concern began to form. "Who exactly do you work for?" he asked, suddenly realizing he'd never asked about her institutional affiliation. "What agency has protocols for something like this?" Dr. Thompson's expression became serious behind her protective mask. "That's a complicated question, Marcus, one that I'll answer fully in time. For now, let's focus on the immediate crisis. Because unless I'm mistaken..." She gestured toward Section E, where the humming had started again, louder than before. "Your plants are about to show us something new." The humming from Section E crescendoed into a high-pitched resonance that made everyone's teeth ache. Dr. Thompson's team rushed to adjust their equipment, trying to capture whatever was about to happen. Marcus watched in amazement as the glowing plants began to move in unison, their vines weaving together in complex patterns. "Look at the spectrometer readings," one of the scientists called out. "The light frequency is shifting." The blue-green glow that had become so familiar to Marcus began to change, cycling through the spectrum like an aurora borealis. The plants pulsed with colors he had never seen them produce before: deep purples, brilliant golds, and finally settling into a steady, pure white light that filled the greenhouse with an almost daylight-like brilliance. "Incredible," Dr. Thompson breathed, checking her instruments. "They're not just producing light, they're optimizing it. The wavelength they've settled on is exactly what these crops need for maximum photosynthesis. They're not just adapting to the environment, they're actively improving it." Marcus moved closer to examine the transformed plants. The tomatoes that had been growing on the luminescent vines were now nearly twice their normal size, their skin glossy and perfect. He reached out to touch one, but Dr. Thompson quickly caught his arm. "Wait," she said, pulling a specialized sensor from her kit. She held it near the fruit, studying the readings. "Just as I suspected, these aren't just bigger. Their cellular structure has been completely altered. The fruits are packed with nutrients at concentrations I've never seen before. And look at this." She directed his attention to where the glowing liquid had seeped into the concrete floor. Rather than causing deterioration, as they had feared, the luminescent substance had somehow strengthened the material. The concrete gleamed with a subtle inner light, and when one of the scientists tested it with a hardness gauge, the readings were off the scale. "Your plants aren't destroying things," Dr. Thompson explained, excitement creeping into her voice. "They're evolving them. Everything they touch is being enhanced, optimized, improved. The electronic interference we saw, they weren't breaking the devices, they were trying to upgrade them. We just couldn't understand the process." As if to demonstrate her point, one of the dead monitoring tablets suddenly flickered to life. Its screen glowed with the same white light as the plants, and when a scientist cautiously checked it, the device was operating at speeds far beyond its original specifications. "But how is this possible?" Marcus asked, watching as more of his equipment began to reactivate, each piece somehow enhanced by its exposure to the plants. "This goes beyond biology, beyond physics as we understand it." Dr. Thompson's eyes sparkled behind her protective mask. "That's exactly right. These plants have somehow tapped into principles we haven't even discovered yet. They're not just photosynthesizing, they're manipulating energy at a quantum level. The implications are staggering." She led Marcus to a makeshift workstation where multiple screens displayed data from their tests. "Look at these cellular scans. The plants have developed completely novel organelles, structures we've never seen in any living thing. They're like tiny fusion reactors capable of converting minimal input energy into maximum output. They're not just producing light, they're producing pure, sustainable energy." The humming from the plants had settled into a gentle, almost musical tone. The white light they emitted seemed to make everything in the greenhouse look clearer, more vibrant. Even the normal plants that had been affected by the spread of luminescence were beginning to show signs of enhancement: stronger stems, richer colors, accelerated growth. "Your original goal was to solve the energy crisis in indoor farming," Dr. Thompson said, turning to Marcus. "But I think you've stumbled onto something much bigger. These plants could revolutionize not just agriculture, but energy production, materials science, even computing. The way they optimize and enhance everything around them. It's like they're terraforming their environment, but in a way that benefits all life forms." A scientist approached with a tablet displaying new test results. "The nutrient analysis is complete. The tomatoes from the enhanced plants contain 3 times the normal vitamin content, plus several compounds we've never seen before. Initial tests suggest these new compounds could have significant medical applications. Marcus sat down heavily in a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. His discovery wasn't just going to save his farm, it could change the world. But as he watched Dr. Thompson's team working, another thought nagged at him. Why had she been so prepared for this? And who exactly was funding this kind of research? Before he could voice his questions, one of the scientists called out an alarm. The enhanced plants had begun producing something new, small crystalline structures that grew like fruits among the glowing leaves. The crystals caught the white light from the plants and refracted it in impossible ways, creating patterns in the air that seemed to contain information. Dr. Thompson, the scientist called, "You need to see this. The crystals, they're organizing themselves into structures. It's almost like they're trying to communicate." Marcus watched as Dr. Thompson hurried to examine the new development, her usual professional calm showing cracks of excitement. The plants weren't finished surprising them yet. In fact, he had a feeling they were just getting started. The crystalline structures growing among the luminescent plants had multiplied rapidly, creating a complex geometric pattern that hung in the air like a 3-dimensional blueprint. Dr. Thompson and her team worked feverishly to document and analyze the formation, their excitement barely contained behind their professional demeanor. "These aren't just random crystals," one of the scientists announced, studying a detailed scan. "They're arranged in a precise mathematical sequence. Each crystal's position corresponds to specific atomic and molecular structures. It's like they're teaching us their own biology." Dr. Thompson nodded, her eyes never leaving the display. "Not just teaching, they're showing us their entire evolutionary journey. Look at this sequence here." She pointed to a particular cluster of crystals. "This shows how they developed their light-producing capabilities, and here," she moved to another section. "This demonstrates their method of energy conversion. They're literally giving us their scientific secrets." Marcus studied the glowing diagram, amazed by its complexity. But why? Why would they share this information? Dr. Thompson turned to him, and for the first time, he saw her remove her protective mask. Her expression was both excited and grave. "Because they recognize us as partners, not just observers. Marcus, what you've discovered here isn't just a mutation or an adaptation. These plants have achieved a level of intelligence we never thought possible in botanical life. They're not just responding to their environment, they're actively trying to help us understand and improve it." She walked to her equipment case and pulled out a sealed folder marked with an official-looking emblem, one Marcus didn't recognize. "I think it's time I told you the truth about who I really work for. We're part of a specialized research division that studies unprecedented biological phenomena. For the past decade, we've been tracking similar incidents around the world, organisms that suddenly develop capabilities that defy our current understanding of physics and biology." The folder contained photographs and documents showing other cases, glowing fungal networks in the Amazon that could transmit data like natural fiber optics, desert plants in the Sahara that could create water from seemingly nothing, deep sea creatures that manipulated gravity itself. Each case had been carefully documented and then hidden from public view. "We call them evolutionary leap points, moments when life on Earth suddenly makes a quantum jump forward in capability. They're rare, but they're increasing in frequency. Your plants," she gestured to the luminescent garden, "they're the most significant leap we've ever encountered. They're not just advancing themselves, they're trying to advance everything around them, including us." As if in response to her words, the crystal formation shifted, creating new patterns that reflected different wavelengths of light. One of the scientists gasped as the pattern resolved into what looked like a complex molecular diagram. "This is incredible," he said, quickly copying down the structure. "They're showing us how to synthesize their light-producing compounds. We could potentially replicate their capabilities in other plants, even other materials." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications. "So all this time, while I was worried about containing them, they were actually trying to help?" To share their knowledge? No. Dr. Thompson nodded. They recognized the crisis you were facing, the unsustainable energy costs of indoor farming. Instead of just solving their own problem, they developed a solution that could benefit all of agriculture. But more than that, they found a way to communicate that solution to us. She turned to face him directly. Marcus, what happened in your greenhouse wasn't an accident. These plants didn't just randomly mutate. They represent the next step in plant evolution. And somehow, they chose your farm as the place to reveal themselves. The question is, why here? Why now? Before Marcus could respond, the crystal formation shifted again, this time creating a pattern that looked strikingly like a map. It showed their location, but also highlighted similar points around the globe, places where other evolutionary leaps had occurred. Of course, Dr. Thompson breathed, her eyes widening. They're not working alone. All these they're connected. Different organisms developing different capabilities, but all working toward the same goal, to help Earth's biosphere adapt to our changing world. The implications stunned Marcus. His failing hydroponic farm had somehow become ground zero for what might be the most important scientific discovery in human history. The plants weren't just solving his energy crisis. They were offering humanity a way to solve many of its environmental challenges. But as he watched the crystal formation continue to evolve, displaying ever more complex information, a new question formed in his mind. If these plants were part of a larger network of evolved organisms, what was the next step in their plan? And more importantly, were humans ready for the changes they were offering? 6 months after the discovery of the luminescent plants, green future farms had been transformed. The once struggling hydroponic facility was now a joint research center, its gleaming greenhouses filled with the soft, white light of the enhanced plants. Marcus stood in his office, now part of a larger scientific complex, looking out over his transformed farm. The integration of the luminescent technology had exceeded even Dr. Thompson's optimistic predictions. The plants had continued to evolve and improve, teaching them new ways to harness energy and enhance crop production. Energy costs had dropped to almost zero, while crop yields had increased by 300%. The enhanced tomatoes, now officially named stellar cultivars, had passed all safety tests and were proving to be not just safe but exceptionally nutritious. The latest results just came in from the global trials, Dr. Thompson announced, walking into his office with a tablet displaying data. The technology has been successfully transferred to rice paddies in Asia, vertical farms in Europe, and drought-resistant crops in Africa. Early estimates suggest we could reduce global agricultural energy consumption by 80% within 5 years. Marcus nodded, still amazed by how quickly everything had changed. The crisis that had nearly destroyed his farm had instead launched a worldwide agricultural revolution. The research division Dr. Thompson worked for, now revealed to be part of an international scientific consortium, had helped manage the controlled release of the technology, ensuring it would benefit humanity as a whole rather than just a few powerful interests. What about the other sites? Marcus asked, referring to the global network of evolutionary leap points they'd discovered. Any new developments? The communication network is growing stronger every day, she replied, pulling up a holographic map generated by their enhanced monitoring systems. The fungal networks in the Amazon are now sharing data with marine organisms in the Pacific. The desert plants are teaching us about water generation. It's like the Earth's biosphere is working together to help us solve our environmental challenges. Through the window, Marcus could see a group of agricultural students touring the facility. Green Future Farms had become a learning center, sharing knowledge about the new technology with farmers from around the world. His daughter, Amy, who had initially been worried about his sanity, was now studying botanical genetics in college, inspired by what she'd witnessed. "You know what amazes me most?" Marcus said, watching the students examine the glowing plants with wonder in their eyes. "It's not just the technology itself. It's how it's changing people's relationship with nature. These plants showed us that evolution isn't just about competition and survival. It's about cooperation, about different species working together to create something better. Dr. Thompson smiled. That might be the most important lesson of all. We thought we had to conquer nature to solve our problems, but nature was waiting to help us all along. We just had to learn how to listen. The crystalline formations, now a permanent feature in special research sections of the greenhouse, continued to provide new insights. They had revealed solutions to problems Marcus hadn't even known existed, ways to purify water, clean the air, and even begin reversing some of the damage done to Earth's ecosystems. The university called again, Dr. Thompson mentioned casually. They want you to give another guest lecture about the discovery. Your story gives people hope, shows them that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come when we're facing our darkest moments. Marcus thought back to that night when he'd first discovered the glowing plants, how close he'd come to giving up everything. I just wish I'd understood sooner what was really happening. I spent so much time afraid of what I'd discovered, trying to contain it. You did exactly what you needed to do, Dr. Thompson interrupted. Your caution, your careful documentation, it all helped us understand and manage the discovery properly. Sometimes the hardest part of a breakthrough is knowing how to share it with the world. A soft chime from their communication system interrupted them. New data was coming in from one of the research stations. The plants had begun producing a new type of crystal structure, one that seemed to contain information about atmospheric carbon sequestration. Even now, months later, they were still teaching, still helping, still evolving. Marcus walked to the window, placing his hand against the glass. Below, the greenhouses pulsed with gentle light, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. His farm had become more than just a success story. It was a symbol of humanity's potential to work in harmony with nature, to find solutions in unexpected places, to turn crisis into opportunity. Ready to see what they show us next? Dr. Thompson asked, already gathering her equipment. Marcus smiled, feeling the same excitement he'd felt that first night, tempered now with understanding and purpose. Always, he replied. This is just the beginning. And in the greenhouse below, the plants continued their gentle glow, teaching their lessons to anyone willing to learn, showing humanity a path toward a brighter, more sustainable future.